Welcome to episode 37 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, since episode 1 of this podcast was published nearly 4 years ago, a few people have appeared more than once. Laura and Tim Moss, for example, or Stephen Fabes, who cycled around the world in 6 years, and the poet Caroline Burrows, who appeared last month for the second time. But I've never invited anyone back for a second long interview, until now, that is. The travel writer and cyclist Simon Parker first appeared on the Cycling Europe podcast earlier this year, in February 2021, when he talked about his Earth Cycle TV programme. He returns in this episode to discuss his latest project, an end-to-end cycle around Britain in the midst of a global pandemic. His main aim was not to clock up the kilometres, but to meet the people and hear their stories. He retold those stories, as well as his own story, in a weekly column for the Daily Telegraph, and in the interview you're about to hear, he looks back upon a 2-part cycle tour that stretched from one extremity of Britain to another, and then back again. But before we hear from Simon, just a quick reminder that if you enjoy this podcast, then there are several ways in which you can show your support. You can give the podcast a rating, perhaps even a review, on the podcast platform where you're listening. You can help spread the word about the Cycling Europe podcast via social media. You'll find us at Cycling Europe on Twitter and Instagram, and at cyclingeurope.org on Facebook. You can also now make a donation to help fund the podcast and the website, and you'll find the links that will enable you to do that simply and securely at cyclingeurope.org/support. And finally, I'm always on the lookout for contributors, especially if you'd like to record one of the monologues that we've featured in recent episodes. If you'd like to offer your thoughts about a cycle or a country that you've visited on 2 wheels, you could be one of the stars of the next episode. All the contact details are at cyclingeurope.org/contact. Aside from it being the first time I've invited a main interviewee back for a second time, the other unique thing about this interview is that, apart from a coffin fit on my behalf that had to be removed, it hasn't really been edited. So I'd be interested in knowing how it sounds, so please feel free to let me know by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org. As always, I asked my interviewee, in this case Simon Parker, to start by introducing himself.
My name is Simon Parker. I'm a travel writer, a journalist, a broadcaster, and a long-distance cyclist. And over the years, I've been on bike rides across the USA, the length of Scandinavia, across Europe, and I have just got back from my latest big project, Britain by Bike, for the Daily Telegraph. And that involved a 3,500-mile bike ride around pandemic Britain.
Yeah, you appeared in the podcast not that long ago, in February, episode 28 it was, and you talked about you called it the Earth Cycle, but it was the trip along the length of Scandinavia, and that had been turned into a TV series, which was available on Amazon Prime, I think. Incidentally, am I right in thinking that's just won an award?
Yeah, it won the Travel Media Award. Let me see, I'm trying to find it on my shelf somewhere. Yeah, the Travel Media Award for Best Broadcast 2020, which we're very chuffed with. And yeah, if people are interested in watching that is available on Amazon Prime. And I think we've also just put the whole series on YouTube, so people can watch that for free wherever they are in the world.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that's I remember watching it at the time thinking, yep, this is high quality stuff, because it wasn't just you and your iPhone and a drone. It was a proper full blown quality travel documentary, and it was a very interesting watch.
Yeah, I was followed around by a crew, so we've sold that in about 20 countries around the world. It's been on Fox Australia. We've sold it to Amazon. It goes out on a lot of mainstream airlines. For example, it's on Emirates, Finnair. We've sold it into lots of different territories. And as soon as we can start traveling again, we will get out and make series 2.
Any ideas where that might be?
At the moment, we've got drafts of new series, for example, in India, in Vietnam, around Britain, across Europe. A lot of it will depend on where we can actually go. I think it's going to be a bit of a stop-start kind of next part of the pandemic, really, and it all depends where we're allowed to go as a crew and as Britons with our passports and our double vaccinations. So what we have now is we have a format, we have the Earth cycle format, and the idea is to try and take it to anywhere in theory, because the whole idea of the program is to try and unearth interesting stories regarding the seasonal cycles of planet Earth as I cycle through different parts of the planet on my bicycle. So in theory, we can find that out anywhere. So we'll have to wait and see over the next few months to see where it becomes available.
Yeah, and that does kind of link in with what we're going to be talking about now, because you did that particular cycle in Scandinavia. That was in 2018, 3,000 kilometres to the southern tip of Sweden. Now, obviously, the pandemic arrived in early 2020. Were you thinking at the time when the pandemic arrived, were you already planning to do a second series of Earth Cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had various ideas drafted and we were about to head out and choose one of those places and go and do it. But then, yeah, at the beginning of 2020, everyone started getting a bit nervous in relation to film crews and sending people out to different places. And then around, obviously, March, everything just closed down entirely. And then the last 18 months, it's been very, very difficult to get anything commissioned by TV channels because the industry is just so uncertain, like many are. So we're just going to have to wait, unfortunately.
So instead, you decided to head off around Britain, and you wrote about this for the Telegraph. Now, you've done this ride basically around the full coast of Britain, I think, but you did it in 2 parts. Can you just explain how the logistics of the whole thing? Where did you set off from when, and then when did you do the second part, and where did it go from and to and when?
Yeah, so last year I was sort of facing this prospect of not really having anywhere to travel. And as a travel writer, that's a pretty annoying situation to find yourself in. So under normal circumstances, I'm traveling to probably 20 or 30 different countries around the world. I'm going to all these exotic locations and writing about them and making films and stuff like that. So I really had to come up with an idea which was going to keep me busy for at least a few months. So I'd done these big trips around the world, but I'd never really done a proper trip around Britain. I'd never really cycled Land's End to John O'Groats. So I thought to myself, well, lots of people have done Land's End to John O'Groats. How can I do something which is a little bit different? And as a journalist, is there a ride that I could go on which might tell me something about the world we're living in right now? So I dreamt up this idea to cycle the length of Britain all the way from the top of Shetland at a place called the Muckleflugger Lighthouse, all the way down to Bishop Rock Lighthouse, which was right at the bottom of the Scilly Isles. And yeah, I split this up into 2 legs, which was broken in the middle by a 6-month lockdown, or at least the second and third lockdowns, which we went through at the beginning of this year. And yeah, this turned into a 3,500 mile journey around pandemic Britain to try and find out how different people were reacting to the pandemic at ground level, as seen at the gentle pace of a bicycle. Because if there's anything we as long distance cyclists can attest, and probably many of the people who are listening to this program will know, that you perceive the world differently when you're moving at a very, very slow pace. And that's exactly what I wanted to achieve from this Telegraph series and from a forthcoming book, which I'm writing at the moment, looking at how the country was changing, perceived very slowly.
And I said a few minutes ago, actually, that you followed the coast. Did you actually follow the coast, or were you inland?
Most of the time I did, yes. When I retrace and look back at my map around Britain, I did mostly follow the coast. In a lot of cases, it became, after a while, a little bit of something which I was kind of addicted to, following the coast. But really, I should have just gone inland a bit because it probably would have been a more entertaining route. But once you get something into your mind, you start thinking to yourself, oh, well, I really want to keep following this course. And that was basically tracing this route around Britain, and it turned into one of the most incredible trips. It is just, we do have a really beautiful country. And when you get off the beaten track, Britain just, rivals anywhere else in the world for a big tour. And I managed to do 3,500 miles. I could have probably done at least 5 or 6,000 if I'd really gone into the nooks and the crannies.
I suppose you can't really get lost. Well, I don't know. Did you ever get lost? You can't. I was going to say you can't really get lost if you're following the coast, but I would imagine you probably can.
I got a little bit. I mean, for example, I did spend quite a bit of time in the Scottish Highlands. But the best thing about cycling around somewhere like Britain is that if anything goes wrong, you can always just jump on a train and go home. So there is that sense of adventure, but you also do have that sense of safety. You know that if anything goes seriously wrong, you can go to a hospital and get free medical care. And for example, halfway through this trip, I had to stop and get my first vaccine. So if I was overseas, I could never have done that. So I think, although I do like going on these big overseas adventures, I won't ever overlook what I have here in terms of being able to go on a 1 week or a 2 week or 3 week journey, or in the case of this latest project, 11 weeks cycling around Britain.
So sorry to bang on about the geography, but did you follow predominantly the west coast when you were heading down from Shetland on the first part of the trip, and then the east coast or the south, and then the east coast on the second part of the trip earlier this year?
Yeah, pretty much. So I started off at the Muckleflugger Lighthouse, which is right at the northern tip of Britain, right at the top of Shetland, which juts out between the North Sea and the North Atlantic. I cycled all the way down to the southern point of Shetland, and then I went over to Orkney, cycled through Orkney, and then crossed over at John O'Groats to the top of mainland Britain. I then followed the north coast of Scotland all the way around the top to Durness and Cape Wrath, pretty much. I didn't quite make it to Cape Wrath; it was a few miles away.
I'm going to say, did
And
you
then,
did you did you cycle to? You didn't cycle to Cape Wrath because did you go on that little minibus?
no, I didn't quite go out that far.
Ah, that's a
A
shame.
long story, but I had to jut inland because I wanted to go and meet someone for the book. And then I went all the way through the Highlands to Inverness, and then I came back out west, and then basically followed the west coast of Britain all the way down through Cornwall to the Isles of Scilly. And then from the Isles of Scilly, I went back over to Land's End and Penzance, all the way along the south coast of Britain to Dover. And then I got to Dover, and then I turned north, and then I essentially followed the coast pretty much all the way back up the east coast of mainland Britain, back over to Orkney, and then back into Shetland. And I went all the way back up to where I began at the Muckleflugger Lighthouse.
You mentioned there you didn't go to the lighthouse at Cape Wrath because you had to meet somebody, because obviously you were writing for the Telegraph, and I'm not a Telegraph subscriber. I think it's all behind a paywall, isn't it, nowadays? Certainly online, and I'm not a
Yeah.
Telegraph reader. Hate to break the bad news, but it's not my newspaper of choice. But you were presumably meeting weekly deadlines to write for them, and to what extent had you planned it? You said that you were planning on meeting somebody up in the north west of Scotland. So to what extent were you dictated by what had already previously been arranged with the newspaper, or what had already been previously arranged with people that you were going to meet?
Well, the whole idea of this project was to meet dozens, if not hundreds, of different people who could all give me slightly different insights into what the last year has been like. Because, with all due respect to books about people going on bicycle tours, personally, I get thoroughly bored of just listening to someone talking about being on a bike. So from my perspective, I'm a journalist, and actually 90% of my story has to be about other people. That's what is journalism. That's what's travel writing, really. So, and that's what my editor said to me very early on. He said, this has to be about the people you're meeting rather than you just on a bike ride. So basically every day, every couple of days, I was meeting up with different people. So I went out and I met lobster fishermen, I met artists, I met musicians, I met artists. Did I say artists? I met, people working in dozens of different walks of life, and to try and build up this kind of picture of how people were coping through probably the most challenging year of our lives, but then also starting to think about how that experience will help shape us in the challenging years ahead of us, basically.
And were all those meetings, were they pre-arranged, or were these people that you kind of stumbled upon when you were cycling down, I don't know, the high street in Blackpool, for example?
Yeah, I mean, about 50-50. There are lots of individual stories which happened organically, but at the same time, I did do a lot of planning beforehand. A few people arranged every week so that I knew I was going to get those insights for my articles. So I knew in advance that I knew there was going to be something interesting to fill my pages with, essentially. And yeah, like you say, I was filing an article for the Telegraph about every 5 or 6 days. So I think in total, looking back on the series, I think it turned into about somewhere between 15 and 20 articles for the Telegraph.
And what was the feedback from the readers of the Telegraph to what you'd written? Presumably, as a journalist working for a national newspaper, you do get a fair bit of comeback from the people who read what you've written.
There will always be the very occasional person who calls you an idiot, but ultimately
you paused feedback before you said person there.
Well, I wasn't going to swear, but there are lots of sort of words used that aren't idiot. But that's just the sort of world we live in. But the feedback was almost unanimously good. And one of my editors told me that looking at the analytics of the series, it was incredibly popular. So it's good to have that feedback, to know that. I think it just captured the imagination slightly about being out on this huge overland journey around what has mostly been a lockdown country for the last 18 months, basically. And what I really wanted to prove, beyond just uncovering the journalistic stories, was that actually these sorts of journeys are very popular, and they are possible. Actually going out on your bike, fully packed up with a sleeping bag and a tent, well, it's the most fresh air, socially distant journey you could really go on. You could do one of these journeys from your own front door, grab your bike, pack up a bag, and just head out. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. And that's what I think became so popular. Bicycle touring, bike packing is only going to become more popular. We've been doing it for years, but I think there's going to be a whole lot of people this summer who have just thought to themselves, I can't be bothered with trains or planes or cars or whatever it is. Let's just go out on our bicycles.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I'm planning at the moment to head out to the Outer Hebrides at some point during August, and it does seem occasionally that the whole world and his wife is heading out there as well on their bike. So it'll be interesting to see how busy it is with cyclists. I did do a cycle around Britain myself last summer. But perhaps this summer, when kind of it really has sunk in that it is quite tricky to get out of Britain in terms of all the the regulations and all the medical tests and the what have you, the COVID issues, that people will say, I'm going to give it a try, but we'll see. Did you find that people who were reading your articles in the Telegraph, did they ever attempt to contact you and say, hey, come and stay with me, or come and see me and I'll tell you my tale about, what I'm doing and where I'm living?
Oh yeah, there's a whole lot of that. So social media 90% of the time is a complete waste of time. I doubt why on earth I bother looking at Twitter most of the time. It's just an addiction, really, like all social media. I find Twitter to be this shouty, narcissistic sort of thing, which I don't really want to be part of for much longer. But if there is some good that comes out of it, it's a great way of connecting with like-minded people to have actually real life experiences. So a lot of people reached out to me on that journey and said, you're only 50 miles from us, you're heading in our direction, would you like to come in, pitch your tent in our garden or something? Which had been the way I'd always traveled long before the pandemic. When I cycled across America, when I cycled the length of Scandinavia, that was just taken as a given, really, that I would always find someone who would put me up for the night. There was a little bit of stop-start in that respect at the beginning of the journey, because it was right at the middle of the pandemic, right sort of like the thick end, sort of at the end of last year, when people were still feeling a bit jittery and a little bit tetchy about the whole thing. But there's lots of people who still let me camp in their gardens or sleep in their sheds or goodness knows what, and we could at least, converse and communicate at a safe distance. So I think we're slowly going back to those days, which would be brilliant, because I think we've all missed that. The thing is about cycle touring is that even if you're not the person actually on the bicycle, lots of people want to be involved in your journey in a small way. There will be days in the future when I'm not going off on these journeys, and I might have a family or, be an old guy and not be able to move, but I would still want to help people out in some little way. And I found that on my big journeys previously, and I definitely found this on this journey around Britain. We are sociable animals. We want to find out about other people's lives. And that sort of really restored my faith in humanity after quite a testing year, really, where most of us have been locked away and not really communicating with each other. So it was nice to just get out there and to, see the country unfold. And like I said at the beginning, without these individual stories from other people, I wouldn't be that enthusiastic about going off on this journey, really, because that's what makes it for me as a journalist.
Did you intend to do the second bit of the trip, i.e. to go back from Land's End back up to the north of Scotland, when you were planning the first bit, or was it an afterthought? Was it kind of, I've arrived in Land's End, that's the end of this particular escapade, this particular journey? Was it an afterthought to then go back and revisit, not the same places, but to revisit the idea of crossing Britain?
Yeah, it probably was, to be honest. I intended to cycle from the northernmost point of Shetland all the way down to the southernmost point of the Isles of Scilly. But that first journey got curtailed by the fact that we had to enter a second national lockdown. So I was in a bit of a race to finish in the end, which was really annoying because it felt sort of quite anticlimactic. And in terms of me trying to find out how Britain felt, it felt to me as though I'd cut the journey short at what was probably going to become the most interesting point of the last year, really. Because if the journey had just ended as everyone was going into a second lockdown, I don't think that really tells the story of how Britain has recovered and how Britain will move on. So we went into the second and third lockdown, and then I headed off and did the second leg of the trip from the 17th of May, when Britain started to go through its big unlocking. And then that took about another 7 or 8 weeks for me to get back up to the top. And I'm glad I did, because it's totally brought the whole journey full circle. I think the story was only half told when I finished off at Land's End after the first leg. So it was an afterthought, yes, but I think it was an important one.
When you said it was curtailed because of the impending lockdown, did you actually make it to Land's End in time, or did you have to stop before you got to Land's End and then go back later and finish it?
Yeah, I was about 400 miles north of Land's End, and then the second lockdown got announced. So I had basically 4 days to travel 400 miles to Land's End, which in the middle of November wasn't really going to be practical considering how hilly Devon and Cornwall are. So I was in this mad rush to get to Land's End for lockdown. You'll have to wait and see if I got there or not, because that's probably quite a big spoiler in the book I'm writing. But let's just say I got down to the end at some point, and then a few months later, I decided to go off and do it all again because it just felt like the right thing to do.
So was the nature of the journey from Land's End back up to the north of Shetland, was that different? Did you approach it in a different way? Did you do different things? Was the whole organizational aspect of it different? Did you change the accommodation? Did you change the emphasis of the journey? Or was it basically sticking to the way that you'd done it on the way down?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as a journalist, I just want to try and say it how I see it and tell it how it is. So just like the first part of the journey, I met lots and lots of people, and I tried to ask hundreds and hundreds of questions. And the atmosphere I found, the country I found, was markedly different to the one I had encountered 6 months before. And that's the most interesting thing for me, is that, yeah, in the first half of the book, it's this quite cagey, tetchy atmosphere, which, looking back on it, was actually really interesting because it, in a strange sort of macabre way, that will go down as quite a strange part of our modern history. Those lockdowns and how people were feeling, and we didn't really know what was going on. There was no vaccine announced. We thought we were going to be in this indefinite lockdown. And I saw all of that firsthand moving around Britain very, very slowly. 6 months later, however, when I did the second leg of the journey, Britain was partly vaccinated. There was this much brighter, more enthusiastic outlook in terms of what the next few years might bring for us. So actually, yeah, some of the stories I uncovered in the second half of the book, I think, are much more uplifting, inspirational, about coming out the other side. And that's what I'm trying to capture. I'm trying to look at how this is going to be, hopefully, the most testing and tumultuous period of our modern history. And the thing is, collectively and personally, testing, challenging times will come again in our lives. And what I'm trying to get at is that actually we might use this trying time. We might look back on this time and say, okay, well, I did this then, and I dealt with this in this particular way. How can I use that to make my future a little bit brighter and have more optimism? And yeah, I met loads of people along the way who just gave me these incredible insights into the sort of year we'd had.
And you can't deny that, you know, for many, many people, the whole COVID experience, because of perhaps the job that they did or the family situation that they found themselves in, with perhaps people dying in their family, people that they know being ill and dying. For many, probably millions of people, the whole COVID thing was unremittingly dreadful and not a pleasant experience. Speaking personally, you've got to be careful what you say, because you don't want to upset people. But looking back over the course of the last 18 months in my life, I think I've quite enjoyed it. I think I've quite enjoyed, you know, I haven't been personally affected by illness. I haven't personally been affected by anybody close to me who has died or suffered from COVID. It's given me lots of time to do things which are, you know, I like, which has been nice. For example, this podcast has flourished in the last 12, 15 months because basically I've had the time to record interviews like this. I've had the time, the freedom to go off and do things within Britain, obviously, on my bike, which has been nice. So for me personally, it's actually, I think it's been quite a positive experience, and my mental health, I think, is probably better now. What do you find, or did you find that in the journey, where was the balance? Was the balance with the people who were making the most of the opportunity, or was it with the people who were really struggling, who did have real problems during this period, who were perhaps financially struggling, who were suffering from severe mental health issues?
I think a mixed bag, really. When I look back at the people I met, I probably got a good 100 stories in this book, all with totally different outlooks on what happened. And your experience of the pandemic was a very common theme, actually. People who weren't really impacted at all, who actually quite enjoyed the lockdowns in a strange way. I also think that that has some sort of correlation between age, perhaps socioeconomic background and where people might be. You know, people in their middle age who are reasonably financially comfortable didn't really see much change. Someone like me, for example, who I'm a freelance journalist, I live relatively hand to mouth. I'm in my early to mid 30s. I felt totally bereft and ripped off by this pandemic, basically, because I was really feeling like everything was really kicking off for me. My career was really just taking off. I was just getting to a point in my life where I was earning the sort of money I wanted to. And then overnight, that just went totally overboard. So there were certainly people that I met who found themselves into similar situations. But like what you said, I did meet a lot of people who didn't mind it. And there is actually going to be, I think, a strange nostalgia for the pandemic. And I think, yeah, if there is a trend, I think it goes across generations, to be honest. I was having a similar chat with my mum and dad a couple of days ago, and they were saying, well, I haven't really seen much of a difference in our lives. Maybe we couldn't go out for a pub meal or a drink or whatever. My dad couldn't go and watch Oxford United as much as he wanted to, but not a lot changed. And and as a journalist, that is what I need to try and uncover. I need to let the story do the talking. I don't really have a predisposed narrative or idea as how I want this to play out. It's just my job to try and uncover a large range of different stories, present that to the reader, and allow them to come up with their own sort of perspective on the sort of things that I uncovered.
I think you were probably always going to be doing it on a bike, bearing in mind the fact that you'd done similar journeys on bikes before. But if your editor had said to you, right, Simon, we want you to do this, but actually it's a pretty tight deadline, and we want you to do it in, say, 2-3 weeks, which would have inevitably meant doing it in a car, do you think you would have been able to successfully write what you needed to write if you were just driving from place to place rather than getting on your bike and cycling from place to place?
I would have probably had more time to write, because actually the reality of this project was really challenging. I bit off a bit more than I could chew, really. The idea of cycling, let's say, 10 hours a day, but then also having to submit 1,500 words of decent, credible copy, which actually made some form of sense every 4 or 5 days, that was incredibly challenging, because at the end of a long day cycling, all you want to do is have a shower, a couple of cold beers, get a meal inside you, and go to bed, and then start it all again tomorrow. Whereas the reality was, I had these deadlines and I had this commitment to the Telegraph to do this. So I probably could have, if I drove, I probably would have had a little bit more time to work on the copy. However, I'm a firm believer in slow journalism and traveling and reporting on my bicycle and being a journalist on a bicycle, that I think it allows you to uncover, I think it allows you to uncover a side of the sort of the world around you in a way that no other form of reporting can. There is just something strangely revealing about being a journalist on a bicycle, that people just open up to you in a way that if you are there with a cameraman or a film crew, the mood just completely changes. But being on a bike, telling people I'm a travel writer and I'm passing through and I'm trying to tell different stories of the pandemic, people were just so much more eager to chat to me. And that's something which I'm always trying to sort of keep at the forefront of my work, be it this or whatever I move on to next. Moving slowly, you uncover things which you never would do if you were passing through at a very fast pace in a train or a plane.
I think that's true for anybody on a bike. I don't think you necessarily need to be writing for journalistic reasons. I think intrinsically being on a bike means that you attract people who want to talk to you, whether they be bored middle-aged men being dragged around on a cruise ship, which I had numerous conversations when I was cycling along the Mediterranean with that group of people who I think they just saw in what I was doing a bit more adventure than perhaps what they were doing. To people that you meet in hostels or campsites or wherever. Were you quite open about the fact that you were writing these articles for the Telegraph? And
yeah,
did that change, do you think, the nature of the conversations that you had? Were people perhaps a bit more serious in terms of what they told you?
Not really. I think if anything, people are a little bit more open. I think everyone in some strange way is desperate to have their story heard. And actually, if you tell people you're a journalist, I would say more often than not, people would be open to talking more freely about whatever it is in their life which they're concerned about or they're interested by. And as a journalist, the really intriguing and interesting thing about this project was that it was a really unique shared experience. Every single person on the planet, every single person in Britain has been through this, has been through the same thing. It's not like in other forms of journalism where you go to a very specific geographical area, to a war zone or to a city or to whatever, and you speak to people about what may or may not have happened to them at a particular event. Well, this has happened to everyone in one way or another. So it's interesting. Yeah, you might meet someone and they might say, oh, it's been the worst year of my life. I'm bankrupt. I've lost friends and family. But then it's also equally quite interesting to meet other people who say, oh, well, you know what, I've barely noticed it's even happened, because that is interesting in its own right as well, because this is being the biggest, most global, most sort of far reaching thing that has ever happened in my life, and I hope will ever happen in my life. So that is quite fascinating, I think. Of course, occasionally you might see someone and they might say, I've got absolutely no desire to talk to you because you're a journalist, and you have to respect that. But I think it's better to be upfront with people and let them know who you are and what you do. And then they have that choice, basically.
COVID aside, which bits of the journey or journeys were the most enjoyable? Which were the least enjoyable? Which were the most profitable in terms of meeting people? Which ones were which areas were the least profitable in terms of, struggling to meet people to speak to?
I always wanted to get to the periphery of the country on this. I always wanted to meet people in rural locations, because I think as journalists, we are perhaps guilty a lot of the time of going to all the same places and asking all the same questions to all the same people. So if you get sent out to do a story in any normal walk of journalism, you'll just go for the easy option. A lot of people will anyway. They'll go to the major cities and do some vox pops, and it's all a load of rubbish, essentially, because you get all the same homogenous ideas. What I wanted to do was go out and meet the fishermen in Shetland, or the conservationists in the Isles of Scilly, or go and meet an artist who's never told their story before in the Scottish Highlands. So for me, when you're actually in these quite rural locations, having fewer people means that you can kind of centralize and focus your focus because there are fewer people. Whereas if you go to somewhere like London, there's so many millions of options for you to tell different stories that it can become quite overwhelming. So I'd say the Scottish Highlands, Orkney, Shetland, just stunningly beautiful places with lots of outgoing people, quite eccentric people who are very willing to talk to me. In terms of the sort of cycling aspect, again, I like being in the rural parts, but then around, the bottleneck of England, around northwest England, no offense to anyone who lives there, it's not a particularly great place to cycle or to pass through. Greater Manchester is just not particularly nice in terms of cycling infrastructure. It's a pain to get through. I wouldn't be rushing to do a cycling holiday there anytime soon. But on a big tour, you have to take the rough with the smooth. And actually, as a whole, as a 3,500-mile journey, it's those ebbs and those flows and those ups and those downs and overcoming those hurdles, which actually makes the whole journey seem more appealing and feel like more of an achievement, because you get rewarded with those incredible views in the Scottish Highlands, or I don't know, the South Downs or Bodmin or Exmoor, because you've overcome that rubbish day trying to pass through goodness knows where. So that's the appeal of touring, as opposed to just being a weekend cyclist who goes out for 3 hours on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, I think it also puts the whole journey into perspective. I think before I cycled across Italy, I think that's probably the best example for me personally. I'd been to Venice, I'd been to Milan, I'd been to Rome, but all I'd done is fly in there and then just experience those places as a tourist. And I'd wandered around. In my mind, I never had the same continuous geography that you get when you're cycling through. And so when I did cycle through Italy, and I cycled into Milan, out of Milan, on a different trip through Venice, out of Venice, and then south to Rome and south through the suburbs of southern Rome, it really helped me understand far, far, far better the whole geography of those particular places. And, when you cycle through drab suburbs, it really does put the whole place into perspective. I remember the suburbs of southern Rome were not necessarily very pleasant. But, I now feel as though I have a far better understanding of what Italy is, rather than just having kind of leapfrogged from Venice to Milan to Rome in an aeroplane.
Well, yeah. And the thing is that what I love about cycle touring is that it's this incredible microcosm for life. If you go off on a big journey, there are ups and downs. There are some things you're going to enjoy and some things you're not going to enjoy. And also, moving slowly, you really start to tune into those inconsistencies around you. Cycling around Britain on my bicycle, I noticed that Britain is an incredibly unequal society. In some parts of some major cities, one moment I'm cycling through the swankiest, poshest part of the country, and then 5 minutes later, I'm passing through a place which is clearly suffering from great inequality and poverty. That is what I enjoy about traveling so slowly, because you would never normally get that. And that's why I travel, even if I wasn't a journalist or a travel writer. That's why I go out around the world, because I want to see these things with my own eyes. Right, it's better than any book or documentary or goodness knows what. Travel is the best form of education. Go out, see it for yourself. And having seen Britain so slowly and the length and breadth of it, in my mind's eye, in my brain, I now have this big picture of what Britain's like, because I've seen it with my own eyes.
How did you find the bit? Because you're based in Suffolk, that's right, yeah?
No, well, I did have to be in lockdown in Suffolk earlier this year, but I'm usually based in Oxfordshire. That's where I am now.
Oh, right, okay. So did you, Oxfordshire's pretty much inland, isn't it? Did you actually go anywhere near Oxfordshire when you were cycling either down or up?
No, 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 no. But I basically followed the sort of contours around Britain where possible around the coastline.
Hmm. And is there one bit of the route that you really feel as at some point in the future you need to go back to rediscover, to find out more about it? Because when you left, you were feeling a bit frustrated that actually there's still a lot of stories to be told about this particular place.
Uh, in terms of stories, I'm not sure. I think I've got quite a nice sort of geographical spread of different parts of the country. In terms of somewhere I would love to go back to, I'd probably go back to Lincolnshire, the Lincolnshire Wolds. I was blown away by how beautiful they are and how few people are actually there. I'd happily go and spend 4 or 5 days cycling around Lincolnshire, Suffolk, Norfolk. I'm intrigued in Britain, especially about going to bits of the country where there aren't many people. I find it staggering why everyone rushes down to Cornwall for their summer holidays with millions of other people when you could go to Pembrokeshire or Suffolk or Northumberland. The change in climate or temperature is so minuscule that I would rather just go somewhere where there's not many people, basically. And it did show me that somewhere like Cornwall is, from a tourist perspective, I think it's just one of the most overrated counties of them all. But then it's amazing that you go somewhere like East Anglia and there's hardly anyone there.
Yeah, I have to say I wasn't expecting you to say Lincolnshire. I don't know Lincolnshire that well. It's not too far from where I am now, but I tend to think of it as a flat landscape with lots of fields and not much apart from the odd town like Lincoln and perhaps a few places on the coast which are worthy of being visited. But clearly I'm wrong.
Well, Lincolnshire, the south of Lincolnshire is flat. It's like the American Midwest. It is just, it's like prairies essentially. But once you get into the Wolds, it's these incredibly beautiful rolling hills, these chalk streams, and it's cheap, much cheaper than somewhere like Cornwall. I'd love to have a house there one day. I think the housing prices in Lincoln are hardly anything in contrast to the rest of Britain.
Yeah, well, perhaps once people have listened to this podcast, the house prices of Lincolnshire will rocket. Perhaps
not before I've bought a place.
Just finally, then, what's next? You've talked about the TV shows. We're still under lockdown, so traveling abroad is still probably more possible than it was last summer, but it's not easy with all the regulations and the various kind of uncertainties regarding quarantine and what have you. Are you planning any cycle tours abroad at any time soon, or will you be spending the summer again on two wheels in Britain?
So in the short term, I've got to finish writing this book, basically. So the biggest challenge for me is sitting behind a desk and getting it done. People talk about the rigmarole or the challenge of going off on a 3,500 mile bike ride. I find that much easier than I do sitting behind a desk for 6 or 7 hours a day and having to hit 1,000 words to try and get a book written. So in the first instance, the next few months will be finishing this book with a view to that being published in the first few months of 2022. Once that's done, I hope that some of the borders will be open. I'll be double jabbed by then, and I'm eager to get back out on the road and just do some reporting, basically, be that on a bike or some other means, really. My girlfriend and I generally go away for 2 or 3 months every winter. That wasn't possible last year because we were in lockdown, but I'd hope to go down perhaps and live in southern Spain for a few months. And if so, we'll take our bicycles, hopefully get a little place to live in the Sierra Nevada and cycle 3 or 4 times a week because the winters down there are gorgeous. And it's just a lovely place to live. we're developing new programs and new ideas for programs, stuff which we're trying to get commissioned. I'm always looking to collaborate with new people on new projects. And this has really just been a time to network and dream up new ideas, really, with a view to when the world does return to some normality, we're ready and waiting to get out there and do them.
Well, yeah, well, good luck wherever you happen to end up this summer, and good luck with the book when it comes out. Any thoughts on what you might call it?
Yeah, the working title at the moment is called Riding Out, because although this journey is all about meeting lots of other people, there is also a lot of me talking about my own struggles with anxiety, depression, and how I have used cycling as my form of therapy, basically, as a way of really managing my own mental health and riding out the tough times. So the whole sort of vibe of the book is that this has been a very, very challenging time. It's been the worst year of my life. But actually, by taking the right measures and the right actions and managing problems in the right way, you can ride out big problems in your life. And in a strange way, I want this book to be about what happened this year, but ultimately creating a kind of a rallying cry, a dossier about how I hope to deal with challenges in the future.
Okay, well, good luck with that. Good luck with the book, and good luck with the future series of Earth Cycle. We'll all look out for them, and have an enjoyable and safe 2021.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Simon Parker for taking part in this episode of the podcast. Remember, that wasn't really edited. What did you think? Did it sound more natural? podcast@cyclingeurope.org is the email address to give me your thoughts. You can find out more about Simon's travels and work by visiting his website, simonparker.co.uk. He's also on Twitter and Instagram @SimonWIParker, for the moment at least. That's all from episode 37 of the Cycling Europe podcast. But remember that you can show your support for the podcast by rating or reviewing the podcast, sharing information about the podcast on social media, making a donation to help fund the podcast by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support, or even contributing a monologue yourself. All the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and happy cycling.